Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of HeebeejeebeezTV. My name is Ashley, and if you're new here, we like to talk about stuff like paranormal, true crime, and unsolved mysteries. Now, today's video is going to be a little bit disturbing, actually quite disturbing. So if you guys are sensitive to horrific details, crimes against children, then click out and join me on the next video. So what if I told you that one of the world's and history's most prolific serial killers, who was convicted of killing over 300 small children, was charged and he was sentenced to jail, but then he was let go for good behavior, and to this day, no one knows where he is. So if you guys have no idea who I'm talking about, we're actually going to talk about a man named Pedro Lopez, and he actually came to be known as the monster of the Andes. But to fully understand what led to these events, we have to go back to the beginning. And that's what we're going to talk about right now. We're going to go into Pedro's childhood. So Pedro was born on October 8th, 1948 in a town called Santa Isabel in Tolima, Colombia. Now, it's safe to say that he just did not have a good upbringing at all. He did have quite some difficult circumstances to live with, especially at such a young age. You're so impressionable, and I'm not saying this to excuse what he did or justify it in any way. I'm just trying to give you guys some context as to what could have potentially led to these circumstances. Santa Isabel is a very small town, and it's actually located more on the west side of Colombia. And during this time, Colombia was going through a very, very difficult period. They were actually going through a civil war that would come to be known as La Violencia. It was a civil war between the liberals and the conservatives that ended up lasting approximately 10 years, and it claimed the lives of 250,000 people. And I mean, it's safe to say that the country suffered very, very much because of this. A lot of people went into poverty. A lot of people died. A lot of people went missing. People became homeless. And, at one point, it was just a place of lawlessness. So Pedro was born to a single mother, and her name was Pedro Lopez. And she was actually a sex worker. And it's said, according to Pedro himself, that he was a witness to a lot of these activities surrounding his mother. He would witness a lot of these things going on at his home, and he also saw her be a subject of violence with all the men that she would bring back to her home in order to do her job. As for his father, his name was Medardo Reyes, and he was a member of the Conservative Party during this time, and he was actually married to a different woman. He had a whole other family. And it's said that on one specific night, him and his wife had gotten into an argument, and in a fit of rage, he decided to leave the home and hire a sex worker who would end up being Pedro's mother, Benilda. Then, just 3 months later, Benilda would find out that she was pregnant with Pedro, and a few months after that, Pedro's father would end up being murdered by a rebel group. So essentially, Pedro never knew who his father was. Pedro would then be born to Benilda as child number 7 of 13, which is completely insane to me. And I'm sure you can imagine how stressful this environment would have been, not just to Pedro being one of so many children, but also to Benilda, who had to provide for all of these children by herself. Pedro then went on to claim that while he was growing up, like I said, he was a witness to a lot of these events with his mother's profession, and he said that all of this really took a toll on his mental health. He went as far as to say that it definitely traumatized him, and that his mother also ended up being quite abusive towards him. However, if you ask his mother, she would say that she was actually quite loving and caring and did everything she could for him. I would personally say that it was probably somewhere in the middle. There's always two sides to every story, and considering the circumstances that they were living with at the time, it's likely that it fell somewhere in the middle. Pedro also had a little sister, And when he was just 8 years old, he was said to have been caught by his mother fondling his little sister, which actually led him to being kicked out of the house by his own mother. And she just didn't hesitate about doing this. She didn't care that Pedro was only 8 years old. She was upset at what had just happened, and so she kicked him out and told him to never return. So in 1956, at just 8 years old, Pedro found his way to a town called El Espinal, and that's where he would spend the next few years of his life living on the streets. He would be sleeping in alleyways, in gutters. He would be searching for food in the trash. If he wasn't begging for money, he was fighting off other people for the best place to sleep. It was definitely not an easy time for Pedro during these early years. Now, this is where things got significantly worse for Pedro. So being on the streets at such a young age, he was quite vulnerable. And one time he actually came across a man he didn't know, and this man had offered him food and shelter just out of the kindness of his heart, supposedly. And he told Pedro that he would have to come to his home to get it. So Pedro, being such a young boy, said okay. He was trusting of strangers. So he goes with this guy, but instead of taking him to his home, this guy actually takes him to an abandoned location where he ends up assaulting and sodomizing Pedro. Unfortunately, Pedro was not able to go to the police because of the political climate in the country of the time. Unfortunately, the police just did not care. They were corrupt. They had other things to worry about. Nobody really cared about a homeless child when there were so many more like him at the time. After he was attacked, Pedro became very isolated. He stopped socializing with other homeless people in the area. He would sleep all day, and then he would forage for food in the middle of the night. And sometimes he would even get into some serious fights with other homeless people because they would basically fight for the best place to sleep based on safety and, I guess, warmth. So life essentially got much harder for him. And during this time, he said that his hatred for humanity just kept growing and growing inside of him. Following this incident, Pedro then realized that he needed to gain some sort of protection. Being so young and so small, he definitely could not do it himself. So that's when he decided to make his way over to Bogota, Colombia. And that's where he found, I guess you could call it, a gang of young children, young teenagers that would go around committing petty crimes, lived on the streets, and basically just had each other's back. However, these kids were not just regular kids, living on the streets, not having any sort of parental guidance, parental support. These kids turned to fittest of the survival, essentially. And it was said that this further traumatized Pedro because he would often witness kids killing other kids just because they wanted more food. And from here, of course, it didn't take very long for Pedro to start experimenting with illegal substances. And that's when he came across a certain substance called bazuco, which is a low-level drug, but it's actually considered to be quite potent and very, very addictive. And because he was so addicted to it, he was suffering from things like paranoia, extreme anxiety, deluded realities, and he would often succumb to violence as well. Approximately 4 years later, when Pedro was 12 years old, he actually came across an American family who was living in Bogota at the time. Now, this family took pity on him. They felt really bad for him. He was so young. They wanted to give him a chance, and so they decided to take him in. While he was living with this family, they were able to feed him properly. They clothed him. He was, regaining social skills. He was becoming part of a family unit and slowly starting to feel safe. And this family actually also ended up enrolling him in a local school, which was popular for orphans. However, this did not last very long. It only ended up lasting approximately 2 years because Pedro said, although it hasn't been proven, Pedro said that he was sexually assaulted by one of his teachers, which forced him to not only run away from the school, but to also run away from the family home. So by the time Pedro was 18, he had turned to stealing cars and selling them for spare parts. And he had become quite good at this. By the time he was 18, he was one of the more well-respected individuals who was doing this at the time in Bogota. Eventually, though, in 1969, when he was 21 years old, he was caught by police, and that's when he went to jail. Here, unfortunately, he was sexually assaulted by 3 inmates inside the prison, and this was said to have been the last straw for Pedro. He already didn't like people. He hated what life had done to him. And this situation in jail was the final straw for him. All he could think about at this point was just getting revenge on these 3 inmates that had attacked him. So with revenge on his mind, Pedro went to work, and he actually started making what we know as a shiv. Essentially, it's a makeshift knife that inmates make out of whatever they could find inside of jail. Sometimes they make it out of a toothbrush, out of a piece of wood, or essentially anything they could sharpen to create a very sharp weapon. After he had had his weapon of choice made, he waited for the right time and he attacked. He was able to kill the 3 men that had attacked him, and it was done in a very violent way as well. So much so that it ended up scaring the rest of the inmates inside the jail at the time, and it was reported that everyone ended up respecting Pedro so much more after this that they actually left him alone for the remainder of his sentence. And it wasn't just the inmates that sided with him because he had committed a crime. You know, it was murder. He did kill 3 people. The Colombian government ended up siding with Pedro and said that it was actually self-defense. And for this, they only ended up adding 2 more years to his original sentence. So during the remainder of his sentence, Pedro was said to have spent a lot of time collecting X-rated magazines and, you know, doing what you do to these magazines. However, he then realized something inside of him. He started feeling absolutely repulsed by these women in these magazines. And he said that it was because it reminded him so much of his mother. He was disgusted by these acts. He wanted nothing to do with these women. And that deep down, he said that he wanted something much more pure. So with that, by the time he was released in 1973, Pedro had developed a taste for murder, and he had also developed a taste for much younger victims. He would then spend the next 5 years somewhere in Colombia. We don't know much about what he was doing during these next 5 years. But then in 1978, he ends up moving to Peru. Here in Peru, he was said to have started kidnapping, raping, and killing as many little girls as he could. And one of the reasons he was able to attack as many people as he was actually able to was because he targeted indigenous communities. And these communities, for the most part, live in very rural, isolated areas. My family is actually Central American, so I kind of have a good understanding of how these people live. A lot of them are living in the mountains. They're much more isolated than the rest of the cities in these countries, and they actually prefer it that way. They don't like being part of societies because they want to preserve their traditions. Most of these people speak different languages other than Spanish. They speak different dialects. So Pedro knew this, you know, being from South America. So he decided to target these vulnerable communities because they were so isolated. And for the most part, police did not really get involved with them either. So his tactics were actually quite well planned out. Whenever he would pick a new victim, he said that he would spend a few days stalking them, you know, watching them, getting a good understanding of what their routine was. And then whenever he found an opportunity that this child would be alone, that's when he would make his move. After kidnapping them, he said he would then take them to a secluded place, and that's where he would rape them. He would strangle them, and after he was finished with them and they were dead, he would bury them in shallow graves. And he actually preferred to do this during the day. He was very, very brave to do these things in the middle of the day, risking getting caught. And when asked why, he said it was because he actually enjoyed watching his victims die. But, if that wasn't already sick enough, that wasn't enough for Pedro at all. Sometimes he said whenever he would feel the urge to, he would return back to the graves of these little girls, and he would often bury them all close together in the same area. He would return back to the sites of these graves and dig up some of these little girls, and then he would have what he called a tea party with them, almost as if he were living in some deluded fantasy where they were all friends and having fun together. At the peak of his killing spree in Peru, he was said to have been killing approximately 3 girls a week. And when you ask him why, this is what he said: "I lost my innocence at the age of 8, so I decided to do the same to as many girls as I could." He also figured that he was doing these girls a favor. He had been faced with a lot of adversity in life. He hated life. He hated his life. He hated people. So he felt like he was actually doing these girls a favor by killing them. This way, he would make sure that these little girls, because they were still so young and innocent, if they were killed, that meant they would at least go to heaven, which makes absolutely no sense at all. But eventually, his crimes did catch up with him, and it was actually one little girl that ended up stopping him, well, at least temporarily. So he was on the prowl again, and he was circling an indigenous community, and he had spotted a little girl that he wanted to kidnap. He was seen talking to her by some of the tribesmen in the area, and he was pretending that he was lost. So he was trying to lure the little girl into the woods by asking for directions and saying that he needed help. When the tribesmen noticed what he was doing, they all decided to go after him, and they actually ended up catching him. They ended up beating him. They ended up torturing him. And the cherry on top was that they were going to kill him in a very, very painful way. What they had done is that they had dug a hole very, very deep, enough for Pedro to be buried in up until his neck. And their plan was to pour maple syrup or some sort of sweet syrup all over his head and let him become a victim to the bullet ants in the region that are said to be extremely poisonous and deadly. However, Pedro would be spared. It wasn't his time to go, and it was because of an American Christian missionary who was living with the tribe at the time. She didn't think that Pedro deserved to die this way. She wanted to turn him over to the authorities, so she begged the entire community to please let him go, that she would make sure that she handed him over to the police, that they could trust her, that she would make sure that he is sent to jail. So the community gives in, and they agree to let her take him to the police. So this woman, she takes Pedro to the police. She puts him in her car. She makes sure his hands are tied, and she drives to the police station. And when she gets there, the police were very much aloof about the entire thing. Because Pedro was not actually caught kidnapping her, he was just seen talking to the little girl. They couldn't prove that he had done anything illegal. So essentially, because there had technically not been a crime committed, the police had no choice but to let Pedro go. And so they told the missionary to take him back into his car, drive him back to the border of Colombia, because they did realize that he was an illegal in Peru at the time. So they told her that she had to take him back to the border and let him go. So not knowing what else to do, she did exactly what the police told her to. So being dropped off back in Colombia, that's where he stayed for a little bit longer. And this is where he continued on his killing spree before he decided that he needed a change of scenery. So later in 1979, he decided that he wanted to move to a place called Ambato in Ecuador, because he claimed that young Ecuadorian girls were much more gentle, much more innocent and trusting, which essentially made his killing spree a lot easier for him. And it didn't take long for him to start causing some commotion in Ambato. Young girls were disappearing left and right, and this time people were starting to notice there was something going on. there was a serial killer on the loose that was killing all of the community's little girls. However, when families would report these things to the police, they were simply ignored or brushed off because the police would actually end up classifying a lot of these missing girls as runaways, or half the time the police simply didn't care. Then on February 14th, 1980, Pedro was caught, and this time he had chosen the wrong victim. Her name was Ivanova Jacome, and she had been kidnapped on her way to visit her father at work. What Pedro didn't know is that Ivanova's father was a very well-respected businessman in the area. He had multiple businesses in the neighborhood, and so essentially he was very well respected. He knew people in the police, and so he, I guess to put it in layman's terms, he had a lot of pull. A few weeks later, there ended up being a flash flood in the region, which ended up uncovering a mass grave of Pedro's victims. That was when the police finally realized that they were dealing with something very, very serious. They came to the conclusion that there was some sort of serial killer on the loose, and that's when they started to really take all of these missing children reports very seriously. On top of Ivanova's father coming down on them, the police now had to act. Then on March 8th, 1980, sadly, the police did find Ivanova. They found her lifeless body inside of a farm shed outside of the city. This would be the last murder for Pedro, because the following day, on March 9th, 1980, Pedro was caught at a local food market trying to lure away another 12-year-old girl. Her mother had noticed that Pedro was trying to get her daughter's attention, and, knowing that there was a serial killer on the loose, she found this to be extremely concerning. And so the community was very, very close at this time. They were all watching each other's back. And so it didn't take much effort for this girl's mother to raise attention to what was going on. She was able to rally the other vendors at the food market to attack Pedro and to chase him down, which eventually they caught him and brought him to the police. During questioning, Pedro tried to play it cool. He said that he had nothing to do with this, that he had no idea what they were talking about, that he was just talking to the girl, that they had totally got the wrong guy. However, police were not buying this, because when they looked into him a little bit further, they realized that he was not from Ecuador, that he was actually Colombian, and he was in the country illegally. That's when police knew that simply questioning Pedro wasn't going to get them the answer they wanted, so they decided to use some more aggressive methods. But that didn't work either. Pedro stayed silent. He said that he had nothing to do with this, and so with that, the police decided to put him in jail. During this time, the police came up with a clever idea. They decided that they would put one of their own undercover as a cellmate to Pedro in hopes that he would potentially confess to at least one crime, if not more. It would be a police officer named Pastor Gonzalez who took on the role, and it actually ended up working. It took 27 days, but he was able to get Pedro to confess. And during their conversations, Pedro was said to have confessed to killing 3 girls a week since he had arrived in Ecuador. This was said to have disturbed Pastor Gonzalez so much that he ended up breaking character, revealing who he actually was, because in the middle of Pedro confessing his crimes to him, he just completely broke character, went to the door of the cell and demanded to be let out, because he simply couldn't take it. He had had enough of Pedro's disgusting stories. So with that, Pedro decided to come clean and tell police everything. He confessed to raping and murdering 110 girls in Ecuador, 140 girls in Colombia, 50 to 80 girls in Peru, all between the years 1973 and 1980. He then led police to 53 additional grave sites. This is where police discovered a bunch more little girls, all between the ages of 9 and 12 years old. And when the media caught wind of this, this is where he was labeled the monster of the Andes, or in Spanish, it would be El Monstruo de los Andes. He would then go on to stand trial for 110 murders that he had confessed to and that police could potentially prove, even though he had confessed to well over 300 murders, he had committed 110 of these in Ecuador. He would then go on to stand trial for 110 of these murders because that's all police were able to prove that he had committed in Ecuador, even though he had confessed to killing well over 300 in several countries. So in 1983, he was found guilty, but this is the part that is absolutely insane. So at the time in Ecuador, the maximum sentence anyone could get for any crime was 16 years. And on top of this, consecutive sentences were not allowed. So essentially, you could murder as many people as you want. You could commit the worst crime ever that anyone could possibly imagine, and the max sentence you would get would be 16 years. And that would be exactly what Pedro received. He got 16 years in jail. But as a side note, because of the outrage of this case at the time, the Ecuador government ended up changing the maximum sentence from 16 to 25 years. So while he was in jail, he was said to have spent time reading, he kept a diary, and he also ended up developing a split personality, with this person being called George Patino. He also found time to give interviews whenever he could. Whenever someone expressed interest in talking to Pedro, he would be absolutely down to talk to them. He wanted everyone to know about his story, which is exactly why we know so many of the details of what actually happened. And he was even quoted as saying that if he were to ever be released, that he would surely kill again. Then on August 31st, 1994, Pedro was released, and he was actually released early. He had only served 14 of his 16-year sentence, and this was because he was being let out for good behavior.
La alegría duró poco tiempo, solo estuvo libre cerca de una hora. Por extranjero e indocumentado no pudo irse a su país.
He was quickly deported back to Colombia, where he was arrested again, and this time he was arrested for a murder police were able to prove, and it was of a little girl called Flora Alves Sanchez, which took place in 1979. He would be found guilty of her murder in 1995. However, he also was found to be criminally insane, which prevented him from going back to prison, and instead he was sent to an insane asylum in Bogota, where he was incarcerated for just 2 years. In 1998, he was then released from this asylum with conditions. He was supposed to go visit the judge once a month, and he was supposed to continue receiving psychiatric help, which he obviously did not do. He then decided to go visit his mother in Espinal, where she was now living, and there was a very odd scene that took place. When he arrived, he was said to have demanded that his mother get down on one knee so that he could bless her. And she was so confused about what was going on. She ended up telling him that it should be him that get down on one knee so she could bless him, which he actually ended up doing. He got down on one knee. But then he did something very odd. He started demanding for his share of his inheritance. And his mother knew that he knew they were very, very poor. She had nothing to her name. And so she was very confused and ends up telling him that all she has is a mattress and a chair. So he tells her that he's going to take that anyways. So he goes to the balcony and starts waving this mattress and chair, asking if anyone in the community wants to buy them. And someone did. A lady from the area ended up buying them. And after that, he ended up disappearing, and that was the last time he was ever seen by anyone. If he is alive today, Pedro would be 73 years old, but there's been literally no sightings of him. We don't know if he's alive or if he's dead. We have no idea where he is living, if he is alive. But let me know what you guys think. That brings us to the end of today's video. Let me know if you guys think Pedro is still alive, or if you've even had sightings of him. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and if you have other case suggestions as well. Thanks so much for joining me, guys, and I will see you in the next one.